Here we are back for lifespan development, and this week we are looking at middle adulthood, which is chapter 10 from your text. We will be covering personality, we'll look at intellectual development, and certainly spend some time talking about relationships. And then we'll look at the changes that are occurring in marriages and family, and work, and of course stress. So let's start off by defining what this period of middle adulthood is. Depending on who you're talking to, it's generally somewhere between 25 years old and 60 years old, but it can even mean upwards closer to 65. That is a huge range, and it's also varying, which means that you could be an early adult or you could be a middle adult, depending on the topic and the psychological theory we're looking at. There are, of course, very significant cultural meanings when it comes to middle adulthood. By the time you've reached this stage in your life, you're supposed to have it all figured out and know what direction you're heading. We really consider adults to be stable, and this is supposed to be like the best period of our life. So there are a lot of cultural aspects we'll cover. There isn't as much emphasis on some of the physical and cognitive changes except for the negative ones. So we'll take a quick tour through those. And we'll talk about the milestones and the crises that people in this gigantic stage will face. And so let us start off with the physical development of middle adulthood, keeping in mind that we're talking about anywhere from 25 to 65. So it starts with being health-focused. Once we reach this stage, we lose a little bit of that invincibility that we had developed when we were kids, especially as teenagers, and we're much more future-driven. And so people are more likely to go on diets, to start to try to exercise, because they start to see how their habits right now are going to influence their future and the future of their families. They also start to have firsthand experience with people who are having health problems. That could be they come down with an illness themselves, or perhaps a close friend does. This is also the period of time when we start to lose friends to sudden illnesses, and that could be cancer, heart attacks, accidents, and so all of that tends to bring the focus on our own mortality. And so we begin to take preventative measures to make sure that we can stick around for a little bit longer. The question is, how long are we actually able to maintain these? Some of the signs of aging as we go from our 30s into our 40s into our 50s are that the skin tone itself starts to change, as does the texture, right? If you've ever held hands or touched an elderly person, you know that the skin becomes usually lighter, it becomes thinner, and the texture itself changes. And that's because the pigments themselves are changing. Hair color absolutely can change. We start to move towards graying, right? And I know I've had friends in the late 20s and early 30s who are already freaking out about the occasional gray hair. The nails start to thicken, which is usually something that's a little bit tougher to detect. And the teeth also start to yellow. And of course, these changes are happening gradually, but they're becoming more apparent as we go. And I put these two pictures of Brad Pitt. The first one is Brad Pitt in his 20s, and then Brad Pitt now, as he nears I think he's nearing his 50s if he's not already in them. And the question is, are we going to be graceful, or are we going to go down fighting? There's a real psychological impact that's created by a lot of the social circumstances around us and what our social expectations are of somebody who is aging. One of the biggest areas that we tend to look at when it comes to physical development is that of cardiovascular health. In 2005, 30% of all global deaths, that means deaths all around the world, was heart disease. And the number one factor leading to increased cardiovascular problems is high blood pressure combined with high cholesterol. So we're seeing this increase in heart disease. We're seeing more dietary issues. We're seeing less exercise. And because of that, the cardiovascular risks have increased pretty dramatically. We know at this stage, so once you actually reach middle adulthood, if you turn things around, if you start to have a proper diet and you begin to exercise more regularly, you can save/extend 1 to 3 years of your life. And that may not seem like a lot, but just imagine if you're not feeling well and you have a family, how much 1 to 3 years could mean. Then there's the losing your senses. One of those things that most people are really not looking forward to. When it comes to vision, we actually start to see a decline in vision in the early to mid-40s. So this is where the need for glasses comes in, because we're having trouble focusing. It's all about the musculature of the eye and all the work that your eyes have been doing for the last 40 years, right? It's inevitable that they're going to start to get a little on the tired side. We also begin to have trouble reacting to changes in the light, and so some people might experience a harder time driving at night or stepping out of a movie theater into the light, and that's the first place where we start to notice these changes. Hearing is also expected. We start to lose this in our 40s too, and a lot of it has to do with what type of torture we've done to our ears over the years. So there are certain tones and certain pitches that we lose sensitivity towards. And so if you went to a lot of concerts in your young years, or listened to a lot of loud music, or perhaps worked in an occupation that was loud and you didn't have ear protection, you would be more likely to suffer pretty severe hearing loss earlier on. But the good news here is that you can reduce the amount of hearing loss if you adjust the levels of sounds that you're listening to. And that can help either slow it down or prevent some of that loss altogether. And of course, the sooner the better, right? There are some habits that we tend to associate with younger groups that definitely are afflicting the middle-aged groups too. Binge drinking is actually a major problem for people in this particular stage of their lives, with 22% of 50 to 64-year-olds, okay, so definitely the tail end of middle age, admitting to having binge drinking problems. That means usually that they are binge drinking several times a month, if not several times a week. We have been able to pinpoint a relationship between tobacco use, alcohol abuse, and relationship status. People who are lonely, who are not in committed relationships, tend to smoke and tend to drink, and above all, tend to binge drink more than people who are in relationships. Weight and obesity are also becoming a really big problem for this population, and a lot of it boils down to simply not having the time or the energy to exercise. The requirements and the needs for being able to provide for a family have increased so much, and the economy has gone down so much that a lot of people just simply can't find the time, and if they have the time, they can't find the energy to keep moving. And when individuals are heavier, then they are at higher risk of illness, right? Their immune system is not able to respond in the same way, and as their metabolism starts to change, we see them at greater risk for obesity. And so sometimes we have adults who enter this stage of life having been thin their whole lives, and their metabolism changes, and they're just not ready for it. And they've built an entire life based on, on nutritional choices that have allowed them to stay skinny, even if they're not great nutritional choices. And that can change deeply as they move into middle adulthood. And there are some genetic factors here too for us to consider. You're 40% likely to be obese in this stage if just one of your parents was obese. So they're still working on pinpointing more information with regards to genetics and obesity, but we certainly know there is a predisposition there. The last piece of this has to do with muscles. You do start to lose muscle mass if you are not using it in middle adulthood. And because of that time energy issue, we see this being a major problem amongst middle adults because they're not able to exercise, so they're not using those muscles, and they lose it, and that ends up creating situations of weakness moving forward. Resources are certainly a big issue here. 75% of 50 to 64-year-olds miss out on cancer screenings, on immunizations for things like flu shots, and behavioral assessments, so if they're at risk for mental health issues. 75% of these are not being caught. Now, with the passing of the Affordable Care Act, there is a chance that we'll start to see this percentage go down, as a lot of these particular items are now going to be covered through private health insurance companies and through federal insurance. But at the same time, there's still a lot of backlash and resistance, and there are states that didn't adopt all of the changes. So I suspect this number will remain quite high for some time. The focus, of course, should be on prevention, and the only way to prevent truly is to develop positive health habits earlier in life, which is really easy to talk about in hindsight, but not so easy once you are in a stage where your health is being affected. So prevention is important for anybody listening to this right now. I know you know that. But if we also can include availability of healthcare and help these middle adults begin to utilize the healthcare services that are out there, we will start working our way towards a healthier population. Sexuality. Of course, as you enter middle adulthood, there's no time for sex, right? And that must explain why sexual activity declines. If you look at this age range, it's even bigger than just middle adulthood. Americans between the ages of 16 and 55 report that they're having sex on average 113 times per year. Some of you may be thinking, wow, that's really fantastic. And some of you may be thinking, that needs to be higher. But it does have a lot to do with, time and energy. And just as we're losing out on that with regards to our work lives and family responsibilities, the same can happen within our relationships. There is a loss of fertility as we get older that affects women typically a lot more than it affects men, right? So as the hormones are changing, women start to go into menopause and lose that opportunity to have more children or any children, whereas men can continue producing sperm. Those studies are now starting to show that the quality of that sperm can be related to ADD, ADHD, and even autism to a certain extent. So we'll see a lot more with regards to that in the next couple of years. Climacteric. Staying on the topic of sexuality, I mentioned that women tend to go through menopause somewhere between 40 and 50 years old. It does take several months, if not several years, to work through the perimenopause, menopausal, and postmenopausal stages. And so the overall theme here is that periods are going to stop, right? Your ovaries are no longer producing estrogen. They're not producing progesterone, something your body has gotten very used to having. And that stop results in periods stopping. And one of the major treatments that has come out in the last several decades to help with this deprivation of estrogen and progesterone is HRT, or hormone replacement therapy. And there's been quite a bit more discussion about hormone replacement therapy lately. It used to just be, of course, we should supplement estrogen and progesterone. But we have seen an increase in cancer and other, we'll call them discomforts right now for women, that have led researchers to take a closer look. And we know that hormone replacement therapy is not always the best idea for women. There are also cultural variations, fascinating cultural variations when it comes to how women experience menopause. We know that all women will go through menopause, and usually in this time frame, but their cultural background determines how they're going to experience it. So, for example, in the United States, women going through menopause are usually plagued with hot flashes, right? Like that is the number one thing that most women complain about. But in Japan, the number one complaint tends to be shoulder pain. They don't actually report hot flashes, like they don't get them. And to have such a difference in symptoms for the same physical process indicates that there is a cultural expectation, a psychological expectation for what menopause is supposed to look like for women. For men, we're talking about erectile dysfunction, and not all men end up going through erectile dysfunction. They can see issues in sexual performance. There's also sperm production problems, and these don't have to happen together, right? You can have one or the other, or you can have all of them. Certainly, some men experience a decline in testosterone that can lead to problems with sperm production or sexual performance. And there are lots of drug treatments for erectile dysfunction, and a lot of those focus on making sure that men can continue to enjoy sexual performance. We're just starting to see a few products now come out on the market that are meant to do similar things for women. So let's switch gears from the physical and talk about the cognitive development. This is actually the biggest area of research right now for this population, and it's also one of the most difficult populations to assess this, because in the past we've judged cognitive development on tests we took in college or in elementary school, middle school, or high school. Once we're at this stage, there's no more school for us to be in a natural setting for testing. So this can be pretty rough for researchers as a whole. There's really 3 different types of intelligence that researchers are looking at. It starts with fluid intelligence, the ability to think and act quickly and solve problems, right? Fluid, if you think of water, it moves quickly. It's the same thing with fluid intelligence. This is really that process where you can think and act on your feet. You are able to think abstractly, so you can take hypotheticals, you can problem solve effectively, and a lot of this relies on your nervous system being able to function efficiently. So as our nervous system and the neurons in our bodies start to break down a little bit from overuse, right, that deterioration over time means that we're not as quick when it comes to abstract thinking or fluid intelligence. So this is definitely something that does decline as we get older. The opposite of fluid intelligence is called crystallized intelligence. And if you think about a crystal and how a crystal forms, it really makes sense to contrast this against the fluid intelligence. So with crystallized intelligence, it's accumulating. It's all of the information and the conversations and the language and the symbols and the stories that we are exposed to as we age, and they reflect all of our background. So we're making connections because we have so many experiences, and this particular intelligence expands as we age. So that means fluid intelligence decreases while crystallized intelligence increases. All comes back to experiences. General intelligence has more to do with a combination of fluid and crystallized intelligence, but again, it can be hard to pin down. So a couple of the studies that have gotten a lot of attention are the Seattle Longitudinal study. If you remember, longitudinal means it happens with the same population over a period of time. And what they found was that cognitive skills actually peak in middle adulthood. So in the stage we're talking about, at a certain point, we are at the height of our cognitive abilities, but then it starts to decrease as we get older. The biggest decline that we see is in how fast we can perceive information, this perceptual speed. So it starts to take us longer to actually process the incoming information. The idea here, the theory is that cognitive development perceptual speed is less necessary as we get older because of all of the experiences that we've had, but also because of the different expectations that we place on people in this stage. My grandmother worked for our family business until she was well into her 70s, and she decided to retire a few months after my grandfather passed away. And she managed all of the company's money. She did all of the payroll, all of the billing. But I found as she was getting ready to wrap up her time there, that she was being asked to do less and less because they had this expectation that as she was getting older, she probably would make more mistakes, and they didn't want her doing that when it came to company money. So they started to give her other tasks so that she wouldn't be as involved in the economics of the business. And because of that, she really did start to lose her ability to work with numbers, right? If you don't use it, you lose it. With Sternberg said that we have 3 different types of intelligence going on. And the analytical intelligence allows us to break information down and process it. Creative intelligence is the ability to solve problems in unique ways, kind of going MacGyver on problems, where you take what you have and what you know and you figure out a solution. And then he said there's practical intelligence, which is really just based on common sense, is how the slide should read. And so the more experience you have, the more practical intelligence you would have. And he believed that if we focused on these different types of intelligences and who has what when, that it would give us a better understanding of these strengths and weaknesses and make it so that we could capitalize on each intelligence during the stage of our life where we need it most. So we come back to the question, is it all downhill from here? Knowing that our cognitive abilities do decline as we age, we need to be considering the fact that we're still alive, we're still kicking, and we're still being exposed to new things. So we have more information and more resources to draw from than other people. And if you think back to how we've thought about old people for a long time, it used to be we really revered older people because they were wise from all of their experiences. Now, in middle adulthood, we're not necessarily old, but we're certainly wise based on all of the exposure we've had. That process speed is slowing, and we are reaching the peak period of creativity, meaning that if you want to quit your job and become an artist, this is the time to do that, and not when you are 83. And a lot of that has to do with motivation. People have had all of these experiences. They're either enjoying what they're doing or they're not. And, of course, being around people who are younger than them, especially their own children, can be very motivating when it comes to creativity. But learning in this stage, rather than being based on, educational goals, is going to be based on what we're motivated to learn and what's meaningful in our lives. And I love the example of technology, right? I'm sure you know people who are getting older who really reject technology and those who totally embrace it. And if you are motivated and technology is helpful for you, maybe it can help you interact with your family, or make it easier to take time off work, then you're going to be, you're going to put an emphasis on learning that technology. But if it's not, then you're not going to, right? There's no need to have that technology around. So now let's focus on social development. There's a lot of crisis and opportunity that's happening here. And so depending on your experiences and certainly what you've been exposed to and what you expect, this could be a period of crisis, or it could be a period of opportunity. There are a lot of theories out there, and Levinson came up with this idea of the seasons of life. And he said that individuals go through what he liked to call a midlife transition. And he pinned it down and said this happened somewhere between the age of 40 and 45, and that this was actually the bridge between early and middle adulthood. So in Levinson's world, middle adulthood did not start until you had worked your way through this transition at 45. During this transition, he said you were doing these 3 things. You were reviewing all the things that you had accomplished at that point, you were reappraising your goals for the future, and then you were basically putting an end. You're closing the door on your early adulthood. He felt like it was a conscious decision, and that there were a lot of polarities where you go from feeling young to feeling old, to from being attached to being independent. And it was these polarities that might bring about kind of our stereotypical midlife crisis, right? Where maybe you've been in a relationship that you no longer feel like is worthwhile or headed in the same direction as your goals, and so you make that decision to cut it off, going from attached to independent. But really, the bottom line is, if you're not pleased with the direction your life is heading, that during this midlife transition stage, you can change your life structure and your goals and still potentially get to a positive outcome. Erickson has, his two polarities that we're working with, and he said that either you are working in this generativity place or stagnation. And he thought that this stage of life, that middle adulthood, actually ranged from 25 to 65. And he said that during this phase, you are either going to be productive and useful for both your own goals and society's. You're going to be happier, you're going to be more mature than you were before, and you're going to be satisfied with your life, and you'll know that it's okay to be satisfied because you're going to have the social support of your friends and family. Or you're going to be stagnant. You're going to be bored with your life, you become very absorbed in yourself and your misery, and that makes you unable to contribute to society. And so while generativity can lead to integrity, which is technically the next stage, stagnation ends up basically in a lifelong process of resentment. And so he thought that we worked towards this goal of generativity. And if we were in that stagnant place, then that midlife crisis would try and help us get to a place of generativity. Now, there's also a lot of really interesting theories out there with regards to personalities. Do we have the same personality in middle adulthood that we had when we were born or when we were teenagers? And there's definitely some indication that that's possible. We have these consistent patterns of our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors. And if that's stable through adulthood, then there's a really good chance that that is our personality type, and it's going to be stable through the end of our lives, especially if there's been a lot of change or a lot of drama in our lifetime. If we look at that 5-factor model of openness, extroverted, conscientiousness, stable, and agreeable, then we can certainly consider the consistencies in personalities as we go. How much of an influence does childhood have on our personality as an adult? I was a very shy person who was super anxious and never really wanted to be around strangers or be in uncomfortable situations that I would have to navigate on my own. But I had a number of experiences, most of them positive, that kind of drew me out of my shell, and I think that a lot of people from my childhood would be surprised that I make a living lecturing in front of groups, anywhere from 5 to, 100. So I would say that there have certainly been influences from my childhood and early adulthood that have shaped my current personality. But there are other aspects of my personality that I have just maintained, right? I still have a desire for things that are predictable. I don't like going into new situations, especially by myself, but I'm more willing and I'm a lot less shy. So I would say that our life experiences are very worthy of consideration. But as the social scientist, I would also say that we can't just stop there, right? It all comes down to nature and nurture. And when things happen in our lifetime that may be unusual or unique, absolutely we can see a total change in personality itself. But this is really a huge debate amongst psychologists. And some would say, absolutely, we keep the same personality. Others would say, no, it changes. And then you have people like me who just straddle that line and say, it's both. So if we want to age successfully, and I think we can all agree that that's what we would like to do, then we need to employ mature adaptations. I want you to just take a minute and think about what that possibly could mean. There was a psychologist by the name of Valiant, and he did another longitudinal study, And he found that people who aged successfully by his conditions were doing this. They were employing mature adaptations. Really what that means is problem solving like an adult, right? So they had reasonable levels of education. Their marriages were stable, not an easy thing to accomplish. They didn't have history of smoking or alcohol abuse. They exercised regularly. They, both partners were at a healthy weight, and they had a lot of positive relationships with their friends, with their family, with their community members. And he saw that people who had the majority of these traits were aging successfully, physically, cognitively, socially. And so he said that if you want to be good at 80, right, if you want to be aging well at 80, then you need to have 5 to 6 of these traits in place by the time you're 50. And of course, your textbook lists a few more than the ones that I put here. But bottom line, one thing Valiant was able to show was that it's not about the amount of money that you have or the income that you've made. But there is more to a successful life and to aging well. Let us cover the topic of marriage and family now. There are a lot of generational differences that become a lot more apparent as we go, and that tends to be, for me, one of the more fun things to look at. So starting with marriage quality, it is during this stage that we reappraise, right? Because there are so many things that are changing. You start with getting married at the beginning of the stage for most people, and then having children and going through empty nest and retirement and all of those things. So there are constantly opportunities to reappraise. And that means that there's always the possibility for a relationship to get better with age because there can be less stress, especially as you weather the crises together. But we know that sometimes people struggle with the empty nest period, right? And that sadness can either really bog you down as your kids have left your home to go off to school or to start their families. But it can also give way to a second honeymoon period where you get to re-explore each other in your relationship, and that can be a really positive time for couples. When there's building tension, a lot of people stay for the kids, right? Because we certainly, from a societal standpoint, believe that it's most important that kids grow up in two-parent families. But what we really should be focusing on is what kind of family are we raising kids in if there's a lot of tension, a lot of conflict, and a lot of fighting. And so whenever you see a couple that has decided that they no longer love each other or interested in being in this relationship but stay together for the kids, this is called an emotional divorce because they have divorced emotionally, right? They just remain married by law for their children. And there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of research into whether or not this is really truly better for the kids. And for the most part, research is indicating that staying together for the kids can be more damaging depending on the amount of conflict that is riddling that home. So when it comes to divorce, most people actually divorce in the first 5 years of their marriage, right? So that'd be fairly early in the middle adult stage, which may explain why we see a reasonable number of people getting remarried. But at this stage, if you're getting divorced, you tend to be more financially stable, but the finances are more likely to be intertwined too, so that can create more complicated divorce situations. The children are getting older, you have a stronger sense of self, and in some ways that can help you cope with trauma a little bit better because you take things less personally. There's the intertwined social network, meaning that when divorce happens, somebody gets the friends or nobody gets the friends. And there can absolutely, and usually is, a sense of failure over the fact that this marriage did not survive the test of time. You have to think that when people get married, by and large, they expect that they're going to be one of the couples that makes it. And so when they're not, there is a reasonable amount of failure, or sense of failure, that settles in. Another challenge that people in this stage face is helping their aging parents. A lot of them go from taking care of their kids almost immediately into taking care of their parents. And that's a really large period of our life to be spent caring for other people. one of the biggest issues is that we don't anticipate the cost. And I'm not just talking about the financial costs, I'm talking about the emotional costs too of having to take care of these people who you love, who raised you, and whether they're in a state of, good mental health or bad mental health, good physical health or bad physical health, it takes a toll on the individual no matter what. From a gender perspective, we know that daughters are the ones who end up taking on the majority of responsibility for their parents. And it has a lot to do with just our social expectation that females are better caregivers, right? They're better nurturers. They also tend to have better relationships with their parents. But one thing that we see is when you look at male and female caregivers, that the female caregivers struggle with the task a little bit more and are more prone to depression. For any child, though, regardless of their gender, if they're taking care of their parents, they tend to be at a higher psychological risk because it's challenging, just bottom line. The last thing that I want to say here, though, about aging parents is that it does create the possibility for a deeper, more rewarding relationship as there is mutual respect for the things you've gone through and the things you're going through together. Now let's talk siblings. Most people have at least one sibling, and we know that having positive sibling relationships throughout the lifespan is important for personal growth. In a lot of ways, your siblings can be the best friends you'll ever have. And that's because they're just there the whole time, right? Like, they're there when you're a child, they're there as you're an adult, they're there until you're old. And so they are the most enduring relationships we have. But that doesn't mean that sibling rivalry does not continue beyond our childhood years. And a lot of the sibling rivalry changes so that it involves more of a mutual decision making. So fights tend to be over what to do about parents, for example, or estates, rather than, who has the TV remote control or who got more macaroni and cheese than the other. There's a great show that looks at sibling relationships and how they change through adulthood called Arrested Development, which is available on Netflix. And it's totally outlandish and ridiculous, but at the same time does a nice job at painting the importance of hanging around with your family and having a good relationship with those siblings so that you can cope together with the craziness that ensues with parents and taking care of them. So our last consideration is going to be that of work and stress. Work is inevitable for the majority of us, and it's become even more difficult as both moms and dads have to work at least part-time, if not full-time jobs to support their family in times of economic upset. And so a lot of things have changed. We have some pretty serious shifting patterns. The contributions and the appreciation of aging workers is constantly in flux. Sometimes we really like to have people who are a little bit older in these positions because they have the most experience, they have better social networks, right? They know more people in the business. And so it's really helpful to have them around. But at the same time, they end up making a bigger salary, so they're more likely to be cut. And that expectation that older people are just not as capable can lead to a little bit of self-fulfilling prophecy. There's a big work-family conflict. How much do you choose your work over your family and vice versa? You have to have your job to be able to support your family. But, is work really worth all the effort that we end up putting into it, considering how much it takes us away from our families sometimes? Women seem to feel this crunch even more, and a lot of that has to do with all of the expectations on women as, the primary caretakers of children. We've been a lot more affected by globalization and downsizing over the last 2 decades, meaning that as jobs get shipped overseas, we find companies needing to cut down on their labor force. They're starting to give incentives for early retirement. And so, you might have been planning to retire at the age of 70, and they're saying, hey, we'll pay you to retire at 65 instead. And that ends up being cheaper for a lot of companies because then they just hire someone for half of what your salary was. But not all companies are even offering early retirement options. A lot of them are just laying off older individuals. not too long ago, a lady in her late 50s, early 60s came into the acupuncture clinic where I work, and she was really sad, and her job had just laid her off. They were decreasing their labor pool, and she was one of the first to go because she was one of the oldest. And she was so upset because she needed that income, right? She didn't have a retirement, she didn't have a pension, but she needed that. And the chances of her being able to turn around and get another job at her age were just so low that she was, beside herself thinking about how she was going to make ends meet every month. Another thing that we've seen as a result of globalization and downsizing are decreased benefits. This can be employers not paying for health insurance. This could be losing out on pensions. In fact, in the state of California alone over the last couple of years, the voters have been asked to vote several times on getting rid of pensions that government employees have been paying into their entire career. So really we get to a point where we have to decide, are we reaching our goals? And if we're not, it's kind of at that point where we have to adjust them. We need to find new goals to shoot for, and typically it's too much to start over, right? And so we just change what our focus is. With cost of living increasing, with health problems being what they are, we also see greater expenses in this stage. Plus, you're paying for your kids to go to college, and you might be paying for, taking care of your aging parents. So the need for work is huge in this stage, but it's not always there. So how do we deal with all this? How do you get through the stress and coping of this particular stage of life, especially since it lasts so long? A big part of it is that we just expect it. And I don't know that that's a very good answer. I don't know that that's a good reason. But because we expect it, somehow we power through it. And a lot of times we get less social support because there's less sympathy for what we're going through. Some of the risk factors for people being at the highest levels of stress are, of course, poverty, right, when you have no resources to begin with, when you're dealing with illnesses, when your parents are mentally ill, when substance abuse is part of your history, if you've been a victim of violence, or if your parents had you when they were teenagers. You are more likely to be stressed out through this stage of your life, and you are less likely to be able to cope with it. The more stressed out you get, the more you dwell on the negatives in your life. And so a lot of studies have focused on how can we help adults be more resilient and get through this stress and be able to cope, given the fact that, this is expected. And a lot of it has to do with family environment, how positive and supportive your family environment is, what kind of resources your family has access to, and what kind of support network do you have outside of your family? Do you have good friends? Do you have a good community? Do you have political support? There's a lot of different levels of support network. And that last little piece is personality characteristics. We know that people who are overwhelmingly positive tend to do better when it comes to coping with stress. The type A personality who is going to be more pessimistic is not going to cope so well. And so that's really all I have for you on this topic this week. You'll be studying midlife crises in your discussion assignment, so I hope you have some fun with that. And just remember, this is a huge stage. We can't do it justice in a quick online lecture, but there are certainly a lot of things to consider as we move through middle adulthood. All right, I'll see you next week for late adulthood.